Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Welcome, everybody, to the Land to Lots podcast. And today we are really excited to have Tripp Davenport, who is the Director of Investment Banking for FMS Bonds. Tripp, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Carter. Appreciate it, the opportunity to visit with you.
Great. Before we get started, why don't you give me a little background, or our listeners a little background on yourself and FMS Bonds?
Okay. I'm Tripp Davenport, born and raised in Texas. I'm a recovering attorney, been in public finance since 2001, been in investment banking since 2005, and started working on public improvement districts in 2005. Bank of America Securities, where I was at the time, had a very large national presence in the land secured space and reached out to me. We worked as a team with a lot of the local professionals and got the first modern day PID done. There had been other PIDs that were done, but not truly land secured. And then since then, I joined FMS in 2015. And our sole focus on the origination side are land secured financings, PIDs in Texas, community development districts in Florida.
And I had the opportunity to work with you and some of your colleagues when you were all at B of A. And you mentioned something that was really, I'd like to circle back on. And I know that when I first came to Texas with my partner at the time, a guy by the name of John Schneider, who's now with P3 Works, he's one of the co-founders. But that was about 2007. And, we knew about the MUDs, that they were out there, and we had heard about PIDs. However, most of the PIDs that we had seen were what we referred to as the broken PIDs, meaning they were laying down an assessment on an annual basis. That assessment was paid, and it was then transferred to the developer to reimburse them for construction costs.
Correct.
And we didn't see too many of them that had actually issued bonds until what you referred to as kind of the first modern day PID. Could you describe that definition of the modern PID in your terminology and what that project was?
Sure. So you refer to it as a broken PID, but we would call those cash flow PIDs.
Yeah,
and it just
exactly.
Flows through a reimbursement agreement back to the developer. It's cash flow over whatever the term of the reimbursement agreement is. The modern day PID, again, it was done in 2007. Trophy Club, Centurion American was the developer. It was the first one where you had an assessment lien put on the property and then actually issued municipal securities to fund upfront in a bare land state the horizontal infrastructure, water, sewer, streets, non-rated, non-recourse to the developer, non-recourse to the city. And through that experience, we learned a lot of flaws with the statute. It was very difficult to work with. And a group of PID professionals went to the legislature and modified the PID statute in the 81st and 82nd legislative sessions. Once that took place, it made it much easier to fund, bare land deals, if you will, upfront for developers and cities.
That's kind of where we jumped in, and we were lucky enough to participate in the Whisper Valley and Indian Hills PIDs, where we actually built out of bond proceeds. But the biggest issue we have around the country is, how do we get that money up front? And the MUDs were great, at the time. However, for us to be able to go in and issue debt up front to actually construct infrastructure was huge. And maybe you want to get in and just talk a little bit and explain the difference between a MUD and a PID and what that means to the development community to be able to access low cost of capital upfront.
Sure. So a municipal utility district is literally a political subdivision of the state. It's its own city, if you will. And we also do MUDs. We bid very regularly on non-rated MUDs, and we get lots of calls from financial advisors that need help with MUDs that maybe are a challenging credit. That stated, PIDs are an instrumentality of the city, and it's not its own political subdivision. So if a developer wants to utilize a PID, they need to know going into it that this is a public-private partnership between the city and the developer or the county, though county PIDs are much rare. I think it's a false comparison to compare a PID to a MUD. I know a lot of folks get seduced into doing that, but a PID really needs to be compared to equity. It's a much lower cost of capital than equity is, or at least that's my understanding from your clients and others. Whereas a MUD, the developer needs to come up with the upfront capital and do a certain level of horizontal, do a certain level of vertical. Then they, depending on the type of MUD it is, go to the state and submit their application to the TCEQ and then issue bonds, which there's quite a bit of a delay. And it's a process that will take, multiple years, whereas with a PID, you kind of get this money really quick, goes to a trust estate, and you kind of use it either as a construction fund or as a very quick reimbursement.
Great. And you're absolutely right. I mean, with the equity we're seeing right now ranges from 15 to 25% by the time you're done doing the math and the pref. So it's very, very expensive money. And to the extent that we can access the PID bonds up front at, let's just call it 6% in today's market. I mean, that's a huge, huge difference in the cost of capital and the capital stack.
And not only is it 6%, but if the developer does their job correctly, and everybody that's working on the PID does their job correctly, the developer's not paying that back. Ultimately, the homeowners are paying it back because of the benefit received from the construction.
Great. And I've got a question that I'm going to bring up a little later just about that issue. So you'd mentioned PIDs in cities, but where can PIDs be utilized in the state of Texas?
So virtually every city along the I-35 corridor are using PIDs as a tool for development. We've seen them primarily in residential projects, but we've done multiple mixed use redevelopment type projects. Cities really enjoy the tool because it's not creating another political subdivision within their boundaries. And so all along the I-35 corridor, we're starting to see some increased activity in the Houston market, which historically has been all MUDs. But a lot of the developments reaching out to these ring cities outside of the greater Houston area, and they're using this as a tool to help, construct and build their cities. Yeah. Counties are allowed to utilize a PID as well. One of the tricks with a county PID is to make sure you have a public entity that can manage your water sewer facilities. Counties really in Texas focus on roads, and so you'll need to have a public entity, and we've done PID MUD overlays where you dedicate those assets to a municipal utility district or freshwater supply. I'm going to use the word MUD, but there's multiple ad valorem districts here in the state.
Yeah, great. And Trip, is in your experience as an underwriter, if a developer, and here again, I know you work for the cities, but if a developer is interested in doing a PID, what are some of the key factors that they should consider? And let's assume that we're in the ETJ, we're annexing or we're within an existing city boundary. Based on your experience and your current experience, what are the issues and the questions that a developer should be asking?
Sure. And just a point of clarification, I do get engaged by the city utilizing a G17 engagement letter, but I am not the city's fiduciary. I'm not the county's fiduciary. I'm also not a fiduciary to the developer. The city has their own team, and the developer will knock on the door of the city and request the PID and or maybe a TERS overlay, depending on the assets that are being built and whether or not they're in the ETJ or in the city limits. And the developer is going to go through a process of entering into a development agreement, laying out the business terms of the deal, both that the city and the developer agree to. And then after that, there's the financing process, which is 3 to 4 months. The developer should be prepared for dealing with cities that may or may not be sophisticated, may or may not well be staffed. Typically, the developer has to provide the cities or counties with a professional services agreement, where they have to place a deposit to pay for the city's attorneys, their hourly fees, that type of thing. And then the developer needs to cut the deal. And, if it works for them, great. If not, then, there's other tools available that probably aren't as financially beneficial, but from a control standpoint, maybe.
Yeah, great. And, one of the things that we see that's a little different in Texas than other places, especially where assessment bonds are used, Arizona and Nevada, especially, is that to the extent that a developer is going to be funding improvements out of bond proceeds, and to the extent that there may be regional offsite, onsite infrastructure that has to be constructed as a part of the PID process, that to the extent that there's not sufficient bond proceeds available to construct infrastructure necessary to turn on the first faucet, flush the first toilet, that the developer may have to come out of pocket with a letter of credit, completion guarantee, loan letter, or something. But the biggest issue for us has been, and kind of the surprise has been, hey guys, we want you to post cash. And that can be a surprise for some of the developers that are doing this for the first time. Do you have any background on that? And is that still typical in most cities, or how are different developers treating that challenge, if you will?
Sure. So fundamentally, you'll need to understand that the city is the issuer of the bonds. Their name are on the bonds. And if for whatever reason there's a failed project, they're the ones that will have to find the second developer or clean up the mess, if you will. Because of that, these are, dependent, not independent districts. The cities want to make sure there's enough resources with the trustee to complete the project if the developer goes away. It has evolved over time. Sometimes a city will have a PID policy that requires you post cash with the trustee to fill in that delta, if you will. So if you've got $10 million of horizontal infrastructure, bonds generate $2 million would in theory have to be posted with the trustee. What other developers have decided to do is let us go spend that $2 million first, and then kind of simultaneous with us spending that money, we'll go issue the bonds. And so by the time we get to the bond closing, they have $8 million to go build out their project. And then others have used LOCs. We have used completion agreements with particularly the publicly builded builders, publicly traded builders, excuse me. So there's a various ways of doing that. But at the end of the day, the fundamental premise, and this is one of the first questions whenever I get involved, I ask, have you agreed to with the city what that delta, how you're going to deal with the delta if a delta exists? Almost always there is one.
And to your point, it's when you look back at the transaction and given the fact that this is the city's credit, and given the fact that it is a public-private partnership, it kind of makes sense, right? Hey, if you guys walk from the project, we want to make sure that we have the ability to complete the project or in that infrastructure that you had indicated you were going to develop.
In point of clarification, it's a special revenue of the city. So it's not truly a city credit in the sense that they're responsible to cure any default with the full faith and credit. It's a special revenue of the city. And because of that, they do tell investors, my investors, that they're willing to foreclose on the property if there's a delinquency. And so the next step would be, after delinquency, is finding either a second developer completing the project. And so they want to be able to solve for that delta upfront.
And I think that's a really key point that you just made there, Tripp, and I may have misspoken, but absolutely the cities are not on the hook for this. And I know you and the legal teams go out of your way to indicate that the city is not backstopping these bonds. Right. It's just secured by the land.
That's right.
So
That's right.
great. The in your experience, and are you seeing more of these transactions being done as a reimbursement to avoid these type of situations, or are you still seeing them utilized to build public infrastructure out of bond proceeds?
Good question. It varies. I will tell you, probably a year ago, we were seeing more reimbursement deals. But as things in the marketplace have kind of tightened up and become challenging, we're seeing more and more upfront. And if we need to spend that $2 million first, we will. But in my example, but we're willing to find somebody to put in the $2 million with the trustee, because we really we got to get the bonds issued and we got to get going on the project. So it varies. There's an ebb and flow to it.
And as you're seeing maybe a transition to accessing reasonably priced capital, if you will, are the bond buyers requiring more due diligence? Meaning, hey, we have to make sure that this property or portions of it are under contract to builders. Do you have letters of credit? Do you have a market study? Higher appraised valuations? What are you seeing from the bond buyers?
We are definitely receiving more questions, and our due diligence is the same, and we take that role very seriously, and so it's always been very expansive. But we are getting more questions from investors about, for example, who is their regional bank. And as you know, the last 3 days, the news headlines have all been about regional bank. But other than that, they're looking at absorption. That we get a lot of, is this absorption correct? And their message to me always is, make sure that the developer knows we want correct absorption, not necessarily aggressive. They'd rather be conservative in their projections than aggressive, because at the end of the day, they're looking for cracks in the dam. And so far, we haven't really seen any, but they're always looking.
Yep, great. And Tripp, earlier you had mentioned a TERS, and maybe you could give our listeners a brief background on what a TERS is, why that's important to developers, especially if they're in the ETJ of a city and they're entering into negotiations related to the PID.
Sure. So a TERS is a tax increment reinvestment zone, and it's a zone that's placed, basically over the boundaries of the PID. It could be larger, but for the most part, it's over the project. And you take a baseline year before development takes place, and then the city agrees with the developer to share in whatever ad valorem revenues have been increased, and that percentage is negotiated between the city and the developer. At a minimum, the city wants to make sure that this is revenue neutral, if not revenue positive, and there will be a cost of service associated with the residents that move into this PID. And so the city, they kind of have a benchmark of what that is, and then they share with the developer the other portion. And the reason a city would do this is to seduce a developer to come into the city limits. Without the TERS, the developer could, in theory, levy a much larger ad valorem tax through a ad valorem district, a MUD, freshwater supply district. So the city recognizes this and says, if you'll come into our city limits, we want your residents to be our residents. Here is some additional resources to increase or make up for whatever loss you've realized by having to pay our city tax.
Right. So by staying in the ETJ, they conceptually have a lower property tax. Once they annex into the city, now they've picked up the city's portion of an ad valorem tax. So the city is saying, because you've annexed into our city, we are going to make a contribution to, in essence, help you buy down that ad valorem tax as it relates to your potential bid or your PID bonding capacity.
Right. And it pays down the assessment. So mechanically, the PID administrator will, before they sends out the tax bills, look to see how much TERS revenue is in there, and then buys down the assessments on a generally a parcel by parcel basis. So if there's a homeowner out there, they get bought down, and then as it builds out, and so the net effective tax rate for the home buyer in a PID TERS would be the same as what it would be in a MUD initially, and then as you know, over time, the net effective tax rate for a PID homeowner goes down over time versus
right,
a MUD.
Right. And as a result of that, you can issue a larger bond, than if you were just doing it with the PID. But now that you have that additional contribution, you can issue a larger bond. So the thing that we're seeing right now with some of the PID and the TERS combinations in Texas is that as some of the ad valorem rates are starting to go down, home prices have gone up. That's starting to stabilize and decrease depending upon where you're at. But you can end up with some fairly large assessments, at least from what I'm used to seeing. And then when I see some of these and I compare them to California, they're getting pretty high. And do you have any comments on that, Trip, or kind of giving sanity checks for some of these assessments?
Sure. From an underwriting perspective, this is becoming a problem, particularly with some of the firm or clients that are out in the California market, because I've seen this before. But the assessments are getting very large, and we handle them a couple of different ways in Texas. The value to liens historically have been 3-to-1 in Texas. They're probably on average now closer to 2-to-1. And then the excess assessment basically flows through a reimbursement agreement that's subordinate to the bonds. And at some point in the future, we'll go and issue a parity bond to take out that reimbursement agreement. But we are having investors ask us, why are these assessments getting so large? And, some of the firms that buy these types of bonds look at it from an all-in rate. And if, a publicly traded builder is willing to take this home with that assessment lien on it, and in Texas, it's like a 305 or a 310 once you add up the city, county, school district tax. Some of the firms are willing to, it's a discussion point, but they're willing to not penalize it, if you will. But some other firms are looking at it saying, look, I don't care if it's a 310 all in, that assessment lien is through the roof, and we're just not interested in buying these bonds.
Yeah. So it's kind of a case by case basis.
We've been dealing with it probably in the last 6 to 9 months. It's been the state legislature modified the state's taxes and how it's taxed. And so what it's effectively done is decrease the taxes for homeowners and through the school district, the cities, the counties, and the assessment is filling in that gap. And it's something we've been dealing with now, a recent phenomenon.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And just curious, what do you typically see for what cities are willing to give in terms of a percentage of ad valorem property tax increment as it relates to a TERS? Is it 20%, 30, 40, 50?
Again, it's a case by case. I would say in North Texas, typically the cities want to keep 60%. But that's their cost to service, and pass on 40%. In the Houston market, we've seen cities go as high as provide the developer with 70%. They've just handled TERS differently in that part of the state. And then we've seen, depending on if it's a residential versus a commercial, if it's a commercial, they're willing to give up more. Because there's just a lower cost of service.
And are counties then typically asked to contribute the same amount, or does that vary from time to time?
In North Texas, they're asked, but they usually say no. In the Houston market, again, it's a bit different. The counties will participate, it seems like, in the Houston market, and then we, on a case-by-case basis, see it in the Austin market as a higher participation by the counties.
And in Texas, they also have other economic development tools, a 380, 381. If you're not able to get a TERS, are you able to use, for instance, in a city, a 380 to bond off of to contribute to the the PID, if you will, or not?
So
in your experience,
380s, as you probably know, are subject to appropriation, and so it's always been very difficult. And then the other complicating factor is the 380 agreement is going to be with the developer, and so if you were to monetize it, it would in all likelihood be a taxable financing. So that's yet another challenge. We did work on a project where a city in the Houston market assigned the 380 revenues directly to a municipal utility district. And so we were able to get that deal done tax exempt, but generally speaking, those are taxable type transactions. And there's just not a large market out there for, non-rated taxable munis that are so small.
Right. And we have that question asked to us a lot. So I thought I'd just take this opportunity to get it out there. So thanks for that, Trip. Really appreciate it. One last question on the TERS. If you're doing a PID TERS type structure and you decide, you know what, we just want to take the TERS as a separate revenue stream, are you seeing that being done, or in your experience, are they using the TERS revenues to increase the potential bonding capacity of the PID?
Once fully educated, I haven't seen a developer choose to take it as cash flow, though there are some projects where they did take it as cash flow, maybe not completely understanding the process, I guess. But because it's money now or money later, and usually money now is the way, if you're IRR driven, that's just what the best way to do it financially, at least.
Yeah. And that's what we're seeing too. That's the first question we ask. Are you IRR driven or nominal dollar? And 90% of the time it's IRR.
Because you can monetize that TERS revenue over time eventually, but the discount on it is so hefty that it makes more sense to pledge it to the PID typically.
Agreed on that. Interest rates, are in the market, or in the news, I should say, and they're ticking up, and who knows what the Fed's going to do now. I've heard that they were looking at 50 basis points. Now they may not do anything, kind of given what's happened with the banks of recent days. What are you seeing as it relates to PID bond interest rates, and where you think they may be headed? And here again, if you don't feel comfortable answering that, I get it.
No. Everyone asks that question, obviously. So what I will say is all of our bonds are priced off of MMD, which is an index that all municipal bonds are priced off of. So whether it's a City of Dallas AAA or non-rated City of Salina bond, everything's priced off of that index. Interestingly, we saw credit spreads widen a little bit, but they've actually come back down. And so what I would say for a typical phase one, bare land deal, you're somewhere between 225 and 250 over that index. And that's a credit spread over that index based upon the investor's review of the credit. And then for what we call master infrastructure bonds, that's somewhere in the 300 to 325 range, depending on how big and how many phases, that type of thing. So credit spreads surprisingly have maintained themselves.
Yeah. And you brought up an interesting point, kind of the phase one versus the master infrastructure. Are you still seeing the use of master infrastructure districts over entire projects, and then layering on the phase one bonds on top of that, or phase two as the case may be?
Yeah. Interestingly, for a little while there, we were seeing very, very large phase one. We call them improvement areas, improvement area ones. Yep. And it used to be they were 200 lots for an IA, but now they kind of spiked. We did one as large as 600 lots for an IA. But now we are starting to see back to what was traditionally Texas, which was an IA1 with a master infrastructure. And the master infrastructure is to fund the common to all infrastructure, offsite water, sewer, spine road, those types of things. And so we're starting to see that come back.
Okay, great. Trip, in your experience as we sit here today, what are some of the trends you're seeing? And I think you've alluded to them over the course of this conversation, but just want to kind of bring it together as it relates to PIDs being used more often, kind of a go-to financing mechanism. Your thoughts on where the PID market is heading in Texas?
So I think with what's going on with cities having challenges to annexation and with the compression of their tax rates, you're seeing cities kind of be forced into considering this. Some cities that historically haven't utilized this tool are starting to look at it closer. We see a lot more folks trying to use it on mixed use projects, with a combination of TERS. We did a very large redevelopment of the old Collin Creek Mall for the city of Plano. But for the PID assessments, that project just wouldn't have penciled out for the developer. And it's very desirable for the city to have that redeveloped. So it was kind of a win-win. And we're also seeing it on, still the large master plan communities. But it's just one extra thing that the city can provide to a developer to facilitate the development.
And one of the things we're seeing is we're getting out into the outer rings. A lot of these rural communities just don't have the existing infrastructure in place to support what amounts to them as significant growth. So oftentimes they're having conversations with the developer saying, hey, listen, we'll help you with a PID and potentially a TERS if you're willing to help us with fill in the blank, a water tower, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So it truly is a public
road. Yeah.
You've been at this a long time, Trip, and I've enjoyed working with you and I've enjoyed your friendship. What has been some of the biggest learning experience you've had while doing PIDs over your career, I should say?
Definitely there was an education process early on for cities and counties. This was viewed as kind of a subsidy to a developer. And over time, I think that's changed, particularly in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Austin markets. And then developers in cities always think they have their business deal memorialized until you actually get into the nuts and bolts of a development agreement. And frankly, it's not uncommon for us to have to amend that development agreement as we go through the finance process, because my attorneys get a hold of it and we start going through the financing process, and we'll highlight some challenges that maybe weren't revealed whenever they were negotiating between the developer and the city team. And so typically the cities will engage us early on in the process so that we can avoid some of those things. And again, we're just pointing out information that should be considered between the developer and the city. We're not advising either way. We just explain the challenges of getting it financed. I will also say that the investors are much, much more comfortable with PID financings. When back in 2015, when we first entered the market, the credit spreads were 75, 100 basis points wider than they are today. And so over time, we're seeing the marketplace look more favorably towards the PIDs. Yeah. The biggest question I get and the biggest question out there on PIDs is we've never had one completely default and go through litigation, et cetera. As much as I don't want that to happen, if it does happen, at least it gives us a little bit of framework, because we don't have case law. We don't know certain things, and we put that in the bondholder risk. So again, luckily in Texas, we've never had one go into complete default, but we've had a few hit the debt service reserve fund. But once that happens, everyone's going to be very interested, because you have a better understanding about how that process works.
Yeah, knock on wood, but I understand. Yeah, and then kind of just dovetailing off of the development agreement comment. I will just second that. Words count. And as it relates to what we advise our clients, be very, very specific and clear what you're asking for and how you're asking for it and how it's memorialized in the development agreement.
Particularly if you've negotiated something that is in contrast to a city policy, if such a policy, not every city has a PID policy, but you can negotiate things outside of that policy because it's not an ordinance, it's a policy. But if you do that, it needs to be crystal clear what the intent was, and just dot your I's and cross your T's.
Yep, exactly. Trip, are there any questions that I should have asked but didn't? Anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
No, I think we started off with this, but I think PIDs are a great tool for developers based on my experience. There are risks associated with it for a developer and for a city. From a developer perspective, you're entering into this private public partnership, and you're subject to future councils, and you can't always guarantee what that future council is going to be. I've never not seen a city abide by what they were supposed to do, but that doesn't mean that they won't. And then from a city's perspective, developers can sometimes be impatient, and you still have a city bureaucracy and city processes that you have to go through. And, the city will sometimes get frustrated with that process. So just kind of go into those eyes wide open. Because when you do this, you're giving up some control as a developer.
Yeah. And, that's an interesting point. And from our perspective and working across the country, but once we've found that a jurisdiction has levied an assessment on an initial phase or phases of a project, generally they'll follow through assessing the remainder of that, because otherwise they get a public policy issue.
Yep.
How come we have an assessment and they don't? So that's something that but you're right, we do have different city councils and they can change their mind.
Yeah, and if everything's done right, and everyone lives up to their end of the agreements and bargain and so forth, it's a win-win. I mean, that's how these things are structured. So there's really no incentive for a city to do that. But again, there are several developer professionals out there that will tell you otherwise. And then the final thing is just, you should compare a PID to equity. It shouldn't be PID versus MUD. If you're interested in control, go to an ad valorem district. But at the end of the day, you're going to get more on an aggregate basis from a MUD, but on a IRR basis, I've never seen a PID not beat an ad valorem district.
And that is the perfect ending to this. And I think that is the takeaway to our listeners too, is just what Tripp said. So I encourage everybody to replay that and listen to the closing comments, because that's the takeaway. Tripp, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, how can they reach out to you?
Sure. My phone number is 214-418-1588. And then my email address is tdavenport, DAV as in Victor, ENPORT at FMSbonds.com.
Great. Thanks, Tripp, for your time today. And to our listeners, in the show notes, we'll be adding Tripp's contact information. So go to the show notes for that. We'll also have information on PIDs. And if you found this episode interesting, we encourage you to share it with others. And stay tuned for our next Land to Lots podcast. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Follow us wherever you find your podcast to never miss a new episode.